Raila Amolo Odinga, the enigma affectionately known as Baba, died on October 15, 2025 at the age of 80. In the days that followed, Kenya witnessed scenes the country has never seen before. At Kasarani Stadium, thousands surged through the gates for a final viewing. The crowds were so massive that security collapsed. Barriers buckled under the pressure as police had to turn to tear gas and live ammunition just to control the chaos. World leaders sent tributes. Parliament opened its doors for his body to lie in state, an honor usually reserved for former heads of state. And in that moment, a question resurfaced, one that has haunted this country for nearly 20 years. How did a man with this level of devotion, this influence, this national reach never become president? In this episode, we explore the most consequential election in Kenya's modern history. We'll trace the political tensions that defined the road to 2007, the events of the election day, and why many Kenyans remain divided on what actually happened, a division that nearly tore the country apart. To understand the 2007 election, we need to revisit the political path that shaped Raila's rise and the mistrust that eventually consumed Kenya's reform movement. By the late 1990s, Raila had become one of the most prominent opposition figures in the country. President Daniel Arap Moi saw both the danger and the usefulness of Raila's growing influence. Raila, in turn, recognized that joining forces with KANU offered a direct route into the heart of government at a moment when succession politics were intensifying ahead of Moi's 2002 retirement. Both men needed each other more as allies than rivals despite their past. However, this partnership barely lasted. In a move that blindsided nearly everyone, Moi bypassed seasonal figures like George Saitoti, Kalonzo Musyoka, and even Raila when he announced Uhuru Kenyatta as his preferred successor. The fallout was immediate. Feeling betrayed, Raila and a group of KANU MPs walked out and reorganized under the Liberal Democratic Party, or LDP. The LDP then joined Mwai Kibaki's Democratic Party and several regional outfits to form the National Rainbow Coalition, NARC. In September 2002, Raila stood before a packed Uhuru Park crowd and delivered the endorsement that reconfigured Kenya's political landscape. Kibaki tosha.
Tukasema NARC sasa ndio itakuwa ni jahazi yetu ambayo tunavuka naye kutoka ngambo hii kuelekea Kenyan. Si sawa sawa? Alafu siku ile mimi niliuliza nyinyi pale Uhuru Park, ati hii mzee Kibaki si ametosha? Na mkasemaje?
It unified the opposition behind Kibaki and positioned NARC as a credible alternative to KANU's long rule. 3 months later, NARC swept to power with a 62% landslide. But the unity that won the election barely survived the celebrations. According to multiple accounts, NARC leaders met at the Nairobi club just hours after victory and signed a memorandum of understanding. Its reported terms were clear. Raila would become Prime Minister, cabinet slots would be split evenly between coalition partners, and a new constitution reducing presidential powers would be delivered. Both Kibaki and Raila are said to have both signed it. Once in office, however, the agreement quickly unraveled. When Kibaki unveiled his cabinet on January 3, 2003, its composition bore little resemblance to what the LDP had expected. Key ministries went to Kibaki's Democratic Party and allied factions, while several names on the LDP list were ignored entirely. The dispute over the MOU will define the next 3 years. Kibaki's allies questioned whether the document was ever legally binding, pointing out that no formal constitutional mechanism existed for an executive prime minister under Kenya's presidential system. They argued that Kibaki had honored the spirit of the partnership by including LDP members in government, even if not in the same configuration the MOU outlined. To them, Raila's complaints were about power, not principle. Raila and the LDP saw it differently. They believed the MOU was a binding political agreement that had secured their support for Kibaki and that its abandonment was a fundamental betrayal. Critics argued that an influential circle, commonly called the Mount Kenya Mafia, had coalesced around Kibaki. This group of powerful politicians and business elites from central Kenya shaped access to the presidency and viewed any plan that created an executive prime minister, especially one to be Raila, as a direct threat to State House's authority. But the constitutional dispute was one front in a much deeper conflict. Kibaki had campaigned on a promise to dismantle corruption. Yet barely 2 years into his presidency, Anglo-leasing contracts were still being paid, approved by the Treasury, linked to senior officials who were close to State House. These controversial projects, many believed to be overpriced and outright fictitious, drained public money while protecting well-connected beneficiaries.
And there are many ministers in the agro-leasing scandal. Jeff, if Kenyans remember, the agro-leasing scandal was 18 contracts or thereabout. It started with the immigration, yes, that there will be passports and yep, people know who the minister was then, who has not, I don't think, been charged. Then it went to the Posta Corporation, yeah, and you know who the minister was and so forth, have not been charged. And then all of a sudden, newspapers in Kenya began to allege that there were ghosts, and I began to read about the agro-leasing ghosts. And because I'm a well-brought-up Christian, I never believed in ghosts, but now it is true, they exist.
Raila viewed the scandal as evidence that Kibaki's allies were shielding wrongdoing and sidelining LDP from the core government. Kibaki's allies, meanwhile, accused Raila of weaponizing the scandal to weaken the presidency and force his way into the center of government. The Reform Coalition that had defeated KANU was now consumed by suspicions of betrayal, patronage, and ethnic power struggles. As constitutional negotiations neared their end, Attorney General Amos Wako introduced a revised draft that stripped the proposed Prime Minister of executive power and restored sweeping presidential authority. By 2005, the coalition had collapsed. Kibaki championed the revised constitution under the banana symbol, while Raila led the opposition under the orange banner. In a major political upset, Orange triumphed with 58% of the vote. Kibaki responded by dissolving his cabinet and dismissing every minister, including Raila, Kalonzo Musyoka, and Musalia Mudavadi. Raila and his allies transformed the Orange movement into the Orange Democratic Movement, ODM, rapidly building it into one of the most formidable political forces in the country. The referendum was more than a fight over a document. It was a dress rehearsal for the confrontation that will define the 2007 general election. The stage was set. The Orange referendum's victory transformed Raila's political position. He was no longer just a coalition partner. He was a national opposition leader who had defeated an incumbent president in a national vote. Raila and other opposition figures assembled what became known as the Pentagon: Musalia Mudavadi, William Ruto, Najib Balala, and Joe Nyaga. After competing for the presidential nomination, they united behind Raila as flag bearer. Kibaki faced his own challenges. A court ruling meant he couldn't run under the NARC banner. It legally belonged to Charity Ngilu. 3 months before the election, he formed the Party of National Unity, or PNU, bringing together KANU defectors, his Democratic Party base, and regional allies. Throughout 2007, most public opinion polls showed Raila ahead. The momentum appeared to be with ODM. Kibaki had delivered economic growth during his first term, but the momentum in the polls belonged to the opposition. There was also a critical structural issue that would haunt what came next: the Electoral Commission. In early 2007, Kibaki reconstituted the Electoral Commission of Kenya without meaningful opposition consultation, appointing 90 new commissioners. This violated the 1997 Interparliamentary Parties Group Agreement, which called for consultations with opposition parties.
When people are just appointed, and there is no guideline on what basis, what criteria is used to appoint these people, you can have thieves among us, and therefore fellows of very poor integrity sitting there. They become chairman of the Electoral Commission.
The government defended the appointments as constitutional and within the president's authority. But the opposition viewed this as deeply problematic. The man who would count the votes had been chosen by the man who needed to win them. Election day began smoothly across most of Kenya. Polling stations opened early, queues formed before dawn, and voter turnout pushed past 69%, one of the highest in the nation's history. 3 hours after polls closed, the first results began arriving at the KICC. ODM tallies arrived quickly and were strong. Raila opened early leads in Rift Valley, Coast, Nyanza, much of Western, and large parts of Nairobi. Through the night of December 27th and into the morning of 28th, this pattern held. Constituency after constituency placed Raila ahead. Then something suddenly changed. The inflow of results from Central Province, Kibaki's political base, was noticeably slower. Instead of arriving in a steady sequence, these results came in abrupt, clustered batches. Some returning officers showed up without complete documentation, missing Form 16As and verification sheets required under electoral procedure. At the tallying center, party agents and independent observers began cross-checking the new figures against polling station records. In multiple cases, numbers reaching KICC did not match the original constituency totals. In Molo, for example, Kibaki's locally announced total rose by roughly 20,000 votes when transmitted to the national tally, a discrepancy later scrutinized by post-election investigations. In 88 constituencies, presidential totals exceeded the parliamentary votes cast at the same polling stations, an anomaly even William Ruto struggled to understand and publicly questioned.
Let's be candid. In Juja, the total number of votes obtained by all the parliamentary candidates is 85,000. The president has 100,000. Now, it means 15,000 people voted for the president and walked away. They didn't vote for the parliamentary candidate. I mean, how is that possible?
In several others, turnout shot to implausible levels, in some cases exceeding the number of registered voters. Collectively, these anomalies produced approximately 380,000 extra presidential votes with no clear verifiable origin. Some returning officers disappeared or could not be reached for verification, with a few claiming they faced pressure while compiling results. Irregularities, including unexplained surges, altered forms, and missing documents, consistently favored Kibaki, while Raila's figures at KICC were often lower than those published at the constituency level. Inside KICC, tensions escalated. ECK commissioners openly disagreed, with several reportedly refusing to sign the final presidential results. ODM agents demanded access to verify forms, but disputes erupted over missing documents and incomplete paperwork.
And we thank God that they allowed us last night to peruse the file, because on perusing of the file, it was absolutely clear that announcements were being made here which did not have any basis, because there were no documents to support whatever announcements that were being made. If a figure is going to be assigned to somebody 50,000, you can as well assign him 500,000.
By the morning of December 29th, Raila still held a narrow lead. 21 constituencies remained unannounced. When these final tallies, many from areas with delays or contested transmissions, were added, the standing flipped after Raila consistently being in the lead. On the afternoon of December 30th, under tight security and with limited press presence, the ECK announced Mwai Kibaki with 4.5 million votes versus Raila with 4.3 million votes, and a margin of approximately 232,000 votes. Minutes later, Kibaki was sworn in a brief, hastily arranged ceremony at State House. There was no time for questions, scrutiny, or reconciliation of the disputed forms. ODM leaders immediately rejected the announcement. Their parallel tally, compiled from constituency forms collected in real time, showed that Raila had won the final election.
All the documents that we have show clearly that Raila Odinga has 4,215,437 and Honorable Mike Kibaki has 3,748,261 votes. That is what we have.
They accused the ECK of altering figures and condemned Kibaki's swift swearing in as an illegitimate act executed before any independent audit could be conducted.
Finally, I wish to appeal to President Mwai Kibaki to acknowledge and respect the will of the people of Kenya and honorably concede defeat.
Outside, the country erupted. Protests escalated into clashes, retaliatory attacks, and police crackdowns across multiple regions. Over the following weeks, more than 1,300 people were killed and over 600,000 displaced as Kenya descended into the worst political violence since independence. With the nation on the brink, international mediators led by Kofi Annan intervened. After weeks of negotiations, Raila and Kibaki agreed to share power. On February 28, 2008, at Harambee House, they signed the National Accord, establishing the Grand Coalition government. Kibaki remained president. Raila got the role he was promised way back in 2002 and became Prime Minister. Once the violence subsided, the national attention shifted to the central question: what actually happened in the 2007 election? The Irregular Commission concluded that the 2007 presidential election was so severely compromised through missing forms, altered tallies, inflated turnout, and inconsistent documentation that it was impossible to reconstruct a credible or verifiable result.
To put it bluntly, nobody will ever be able to say who won or who lost this election.
While the Commission avoided declaring who benefited more, independent observer missions and several ECK insiders later indicated that the final phases of tallying at the national level appeared to favor the incumbent. That's why, nearly 2 decades later, the 2007 election remains unresolved in Kenya's collective memory. To some, Kibaki's victory reflected the sheer strength of his support across central Kenya and parts of eastern. To others, Raila's victory was stolen during a chaotic and opaque tallying process, one that ODM began challenging even before the final announcement, while the incumbent's camp offered little public commentary as disputes escalated inside KICC.